Welcome to week 2 of the workshop. I'm just going ahead and sharing the links to the different pages real quick, make them know we're live, and then we will commence. So get sharing these links then, people. If you guys want to share, I appreciate it. I know last time we talked about possibly dressing like a vampire, but I don't know where my red hood is, so I didn't do that. Let's see. Twitter. We are live. Over here. Boop, 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 boop. Okay, here we are. All links have been posted, and we are ready to begin. So, welcome. It's good to have you all back here with us today. We are going to be talking about vampires in literature, and a little bit as well about vampires in folklore, because, before literature we have folklore. So I am going to be posting the links to the pages that I read the information regarding all these facts to. You can read the articles as well. They were very good. And let's jump right into that. Let me just go ahead and open some things here, and then we'll get going. Now, the interesting thing about folklore regarding vampires is that most of it is located towards Asia. We are talking about, and when I say Asia, I know everybody thinks, like Japanese people, but I'm referring to Russians, and let me go over some of the countries here. I want to, be as accurate as possible. We're talking about Russia, Poland, the Czech Republic, Bulgaria, all those countries. Those were the most predominant in terms of folklore and getting into all of these rumors about creatures that suck blood and are undead and whatnot. And interestingly enough, folklore vampires are very different from our concept of literary vampires, especially from modern literary vampires that we know have deviated a lot from how it all began. Now, a few fun facts that I have written down regarding folklore vampires is how they were created, because our general concept of what a vampire is, it is either has always been a vampire or, simply got bitten and turned into a vampire. But in folklore, there were 3 predominant ways in which vampires were created. And it was, if someone committed suicide, then they would become a vampire. If someone was cursed by their parents or the church, then they would become a vampire. Or if a cat walks over the person's grave, then they would also become a vampire, which is a very curious thing. Like, the cat one's a little weird. Everything else is passable. Like, sure, why not? I mean, suicide, being cursed, that one's, like, I feel like the most relatable out of all of them. But the whole cat thing, that's just a little weird, like, why cats? Cats are such a common thing. I feel like a cat walking over someone's grave is probably a very common thing, something that happens all the time. Doesn't seem that out of the ordinary, so it's really weird to me, the idea that that is a thing. But, you know, folklore is folklore, I suppose. Other interesting things about vampires in the folklore. The ways to identify them. Vampires in folklore could be identified in various ways. Either after that person died, then all of their family members and their livestock would begin to die as well. Another thing is, if you found a hole the size of a serpent next to the vampire's grave, it was believed that the vampire used that hole to exit the grave, which is curious because I feel like that is a very small hole. I mean, how big is that snake? Or maybe at no point here are they mentioning vampires turning into bats, but if they did think that they turned into bats, then it would seem more realistic that the bat could fit through that hole rather than a corpse the size of a human. The third one is a white horse or a gander refuses to walk over the grave. Another one is that the corpse is red in the face, or that the corpse has a foot retracted and forced into the corner of the coffin, or even that the corpse's mouth is filled with blood. I feel like that last one is like, oh, open the corpse's mouth. If it's filled with blood, it's a vampire. It seems like at that point, I wouldn't want to be so close, you know? I would want to be as far away as possible. If I think this person's a vampire, I'm not going to be opening no mouths to find out if there's blood in there. Like, they're going to friggin' attack me or something, man. That is not safe. Brave people of the folklores. Now, the ways in which they killed their vampires are also a little bit different. Some we're more accustomed to and we've seen in our literature, and others are pretty out there and compared to the ways that we're used to seeing vampires killed. Something curious from folklore that I have personally never seen in literature is that, oh, I'm sorry, I'm just checking out some comments that are coming in. Isn't cats sometimes associated with magic and witchcraft and whatnot? Cats are evil. That is true. Cats are associated with magic and you know, evil and all that. But I feel like it's mostly black cats, not so much other regular cats, you know. And if it had been like if a black cat walks over your grave, I feel like that's more oriented towards those typical things that you hear, like, oh my gosh, you know, bad luck and whatever, than what we were looking at previously. So then I feel like it's a little more valid point, you know, the black cat thing. A way to kill a vampire, going back to what I was saying, you put a nail under his tongue, which is like really weird. I'm just like, really? A nail under the tongue? I've never read that before or heard of it or anything. So I thought that was a little weird. Like, that was a peculiar way to kill a vampire. And here is a list of other ways to kill them. Ways that you would kill a vampire in folklore. They can be stopped or destroyed if a stake is driven through the heart. That's typical. We've heard it many times. And in one folklore in particular, a district needle is recommended. And in others, a hot iron rod is preferred for the staking and whatever of the vampire. Oh, I'm sorry, I hit the microphone. Other ways that you could kill a vampire: small stones, garlic, or a millet can be put into their mouths. And a nail, as I said earlier, can be put under their tongue. The coffin can be bound with canes of wild roses, or 9 distaffs can be driven into the grave. Tow can be stoned on the grave and set on fire to singe the vampire. And here is a fun little bit that I read regarding vampires in folklore, which I found very amusing because I was like, wow, this is it was funny. So I'm going to read it to you guys. And I quote, "Vampires are the most active on St. Andrew's Day and St. George's Day, when garlic could be put on the windows and doors of the house, and all the cows should be rubbed with garlic. all lamps should be put out, all implements in the house should be turned upside down, and all of the inhabitants should turn their shirts inside out. Perhaps the most interesting suggestion is not to sleep at all on such nights, but to tell stories, for vampires cannot approach while stories are being told. Which I thought was hilarious. It's just like, oh, wait, guys, wait. They're telling a story. You can't just kill someone in the middle of a story, man. Respect, okay? Wait for them to finish the story and then kill them, you know? Respect. Vampires were respectful creatures, apparently. Which makes me think about a video that was posted in the workshops page, and I'm going to send that to you guys. We have a private page for members, but we also have a public one, and I'm going to share that video because it was hilarious, and it was talking about all the different ways that vampires are killed and how funny it is. Like, I wouldn't be afraid of vampires if they were real because they're so easy to kill. It was funny. And when I read the whole thing about they cannot approach if a story is being told, it made me think about in the video how they talked about a vampire cannot enter your home unless you invite him in, which is hilarious. Like, well, then I don't have to worry about nothing then, because they can't come inside my house. I just have to stay inside my house and be safe. Now, there was a man. I am not sure if this is the correct way to pronounce his name, so forgive me. A man named Perkowski, and he was a scholar of Slavic language and literature, and he examined 19 different vampire stories from different locations around the world, and he, at the end of it, gathered that there were only 2 similarities between all vampire stories. Like, they all varied. They didn't have that many things in common. There were 2 things, though, that never varied. The first one was that all the stories referred to an undead creature returning to prey on the living. And the second was that they all magically deal with the real problem of unexplained deaths, particularly due to contagious illnesses. And then they moved on to talk about how in that era it became a big issue. Like, people, when other people died of unknown reasons, they were quickly speculative and trying to find a way to console themselves and feel better about things. And there are even church documents that mention priests attempting to eradicate both the belief of vampires and the mutilation of corpses, because people would dig up the corpses and do all sorts of things to them in order to make sure that they wouldn't come back from the dead, which is kind of freaky, the stuff they did. I mean, it talks about one story where they believed that their relative was a vampire and they had buried her when she died, and then suddenly all the children started dying. So they were like, oh my god, she's a vampire, because as we have discussed earlier, if your relatives start dying, then you're a vampire. So they dug her up and they sliced her body in half and dug her back into her grave. But people kept dying. So their relatives went back to her grave, dug her up again. When they dug her up again, she was whole. She was not split in half like they had left her. And what they did was they took her out, put her under a big tree, and they started taking out all her organs, and they burned her heart, and they burned her body, they mutilated her completely, and then with those ashes, they put them inside water, made the kids drink the water, and then the kids stopped dying. Which is like, that's kind of freaky. That whole thing is kind of freaky, and I don't know if I believe that actually happened. And, you know, I'm a little disturbed that they fed their kids the ashes of their dead relative who they believed was a vampire. That is a little peculiar. It's like, but, you know, to each his own, I suppose, right? Now, vampires in literature. That is our topic today, and that is our main focus, because after all, that's what we're writing about. We're writing about vampires, so we want to know how they have been portrayed throughout the years in literature. And something that I found in common in everything that I read was that the most important literary work about vampires that there were vampire stories before this, but this was the story that made vampires a thing in literature. You know, this was the first one that is like, this is a thing now, that made it a thing. And it is John Polidori's The Vampire, a Tale. And John Polidori is one of the people who was in Lord Byron's mansion that stormy night when they started telling ghost stories. We are all familiar with Mary Shelley and her Frankenstein, and that book started as a short story that she told at Lord Byron's house when there was a storm. Among the people who were there was this man, John Polidori. And who was John Polidori? John Polidori was Lord Byron's physician and friend at the time. And back then, in fact, when they were writing ghost stories, Mary Shelley was saying that she pitied this man because he didn't have any good ideas regarding the story. I'm sorry, just reading another comment. What the heck, they drank their mother. I know, right? They drank their mom. It's weird. It's just, I'm sorry that I have all these delayed reactions to your comments, but I go at a different pace than you guys do, so I see your comments much later because you see me later than real time. Internet, it's not perfect, but someday it will be, hopefully, or at least as close as it can get. So, this man, Lord Polidori, John Polidori, Mary Shelley said she pitied him at the time because all he had was like an idea for something about a woman's skull. I'm just trying to look it up right here once more. Okay, here we go. Mary Shelley mentions Polidori, and she says that she felt bad for him because all he had was some terrible idea about a skull-headed lady, which he soon abandoned. And even though that was what at the time when they had to tell ghost stories, that was his idea. The idea for the vampire actually comes after reading Lord Byron's story that Lord Byron began, but he never finished. And then based on that came the inspiration for The Vampire, a Tale. And by the time that Polidori wrote the Vampire, he and Byron were no longer friends, and it is believed that the main character of the vampire, who is called Lord Ruthven, is based on Lord Byron because they are both mad, bad, and dangerous to know. Quick overview related to the vampire and what is the vampire as a whole. So in the vampire, and that's vampire with a Y, it is based on, I'm sorry, hold on. I'm just going over my notes and I'm a little confused. It is clear in the novel that the vampire is a figure out of folklore. It's based on everything we have previously talked to related to folklore, which is why I wanted to discuss vampires in folklore before we began to discuss vampires in literature, because that very first vampire that became the insignia for all vampires was based on folklore. But we will see that in this story, we have some changes between the folklore and what will become what we know as vampires. And in the story, the protagonist, Lord Ruthven, he meets this woman, this beautiful woman, when he goes to Greece. And that's where they have this whole issue and melodrama. And how did he become a vampire? It is never clear. In fact, in his story, it is never projected how you can even kill a vampire. You are never told that there are any weaknesses that he has, and he never dies in the story. In fact, the vampire is triumphant at the end of the story. And in the story, you see how he becomes one in the way of he gets shot. And rays of moonlight shine over him, and then he mysteriously comes back to life. So that's the glimpse we get of how he became a vampire. And after that, we're never shown any weakness or anything. In fact, he was not affected by daylight, crosses, or garlic, which are all the iconic things that we think when we're like, oh wow, vampires. And it's like the first thing that became the symbol for vampires, and he was not weak to daylight or garlic or crosses. It is never presented that he has any weaknesses, and we never figure out if it can be killed, if you can kill a vampire or not. And by the end of the story, he ends up marrying the girl that he fell in love with at the beginning, and then he kills her on their wedding night. And we are told in the story that she had glutted the thirst of a vampire with a Y. So yeah, he sucked all her blood out and she died. That's what happened. He married her, and then on their wedding night, they didn't get jiggy with it. He sucked all her blood out and she died. How romantic. Really turns the ladies on. So that is the story that became the insignia for vampires everywhere. Now, related to everything about vampires, what were the biggest ones? Like, what were the biggest symbols throughout the years? This was the very first big symbol. And now I am going to go through different eras and just talk about what were big things about vampire books in those eras. That first bit that we got about the vampire was written in 1816. The next time that we have a big deal, like after that, it became a big deal. Everybody was talking vampires, vampires, vampires. People were going crazy over them. From 1845 to 1847, that was the most popular period for vampire stories. And in fact, Charlotte Bronte mentions it in her novel, Wuthering Heights. I believe it's called Wuthering Heights, if I am not mistaken. It was in that one specifically. Yeah. Anyway, she mentions it in Wuthering Heights. She talks about how, I believe it was the maid who thought, oh, I'm sorry, Charlotte Bronte, my goodness. That's not Charlotte Bronte. Charlotte Bronte wrote Jane Eyre. It's Emily Bronte. I am sorry. I am so sorry. Emily Bronte. I don't know why I said Charlotte. Emily Bronte, her sister, referenced this whole vampire fad in 1847 in her novel Wuthering Heights, when the housekeeper suspects Heathcliff of being a vampire. It was a big deal back then. It became incredibly popular. Everybody was talking vampires. And in those years, 1845 to 1847, James Malcolm Rymer published Varney the Vampire. Yes, Varney. Not Barney with a B, Varney with a V. Varney the Vampire. That is a thing. And apparently, it is described by most as being a pretty, pathetic kind of thing. Just like, pathetic comedy. I don't know. A series, this is one of the descriptions provided for us, a series of penny dreadfuls, which were an early type of pulp pamphlet aimed at working class adolescents. And the serialization proved to be very popular. It was little fragmented that came out every week, and eventually it was all collected into one big book. And this was very influential for the future vampire lore because it was perpetuating many themes common to tales that we have today. Like with Varney the Vampire, we first introduced the concept of vampires having fangs. Before that, vampires did not have fangs. How did they suck blood? I don't know. That is an excellent question. We will forever wonder. So, for the first time, vampires have fangs that leave 2 puncture wounds. They come into windows at night to attack young maidens, and they have hypnotic powers as well as superhuman strength. So Varney the Vampire, as silly as he sounds, was the first vampire to have all these pretty badass characteristics. Also, Varney was the first vampire who regretted his condition. Like, he didn't want to be a vampire, but he couldn't help the fact that he was a vampire. And he was the first one to be that way. Like, I'm a vampire, but I'm sad that I'm a vampire, but I'm still a vampire. That was Varney. The next period where we see a big work, influential work related to vampires is 1872 with Sheridan Le Fanu's classic novella Carmilla, or Carmilla. I don't know which of the two is the pronunciation. He seems French, so I'm thinking it's the other one. I don't know. But this novella, and I was like very surprised when I started like looking up information regarding to this. It's the first lesbian, yes, you heard me, lesbian vampire novel. 1872. Lesbian vampire novel. 1872. I am amazed. Like, that must have been the biggest controversy in the world. I mean, 1872, seriously? Some things are cray-cray. I'm getting more comments. Through their fingers like steel. I am not sure what you're making reference to, AK Red 10. And Miguel, don't worry. It's okay. We don't mind your lateness. You can always watch the beginning of this later. We have talked about vampire folklore, and we are talking about vampires in literature. And we talked about the very first big one, which was by John Polidori. My goodness, today I'm stumbling all over my words. By John Polidori, who was in Lord Byron's mansion that night when they were telling ghost stories. So yeah, Carmilla. Very first lesbian vampire novel. Then, you know, it was the first example of what later became the whole lesbian vampire trope. And it was a very successful erotic fixation of vampire into literature. It was like vampires were known for alluring women and things of that sort before, but Carmilla was a very sexual, very erotic novel, and so it was the first one where we got that whole, oh yeah, get jiggy with me, you vampire, man, just, but at a whole nother level, man, like, this is probably the most disgusting porno that existed in 1872, I'm sure of it, because it is about lesbian vampire women, and I have not read it, but come on. It's 1872 and we're reading about lesbian vampires. I'm pretty sure this has got to be like friggin' quadruple X for that time. So, for all you fans of erotica and vampires, Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu. And by the way, that is a big, big deal in literature. It's not just anything. So the lesbian vampire came before Dracula? It did. The lesbian vampire came before Dracula. Lesbian vampire came out in 1872, and Dracula, which is the next thing I'm going to talk about, came out in 1897. So now we're going to talk about Dracula. Dracula, Dracula, Dracula. What can we say about Dracula? It is like the most famous interpretation that people of our generation are aware of. We talk vampires, and there are only two things that come to mind nowadays for people our age. The first one, Twilight. The second one, Dracula. Everybody thinks Dracula. Dracula came out in 1897, and it was written by Bram Stoker. The book Dracula, it mixed medieval myths with previous vampire fiction. I am so sorry myself. It mixed medieval myths and previous vampire fiction with sex, blood, and death to create a novel that struck the chord for Britain in that century. Now, Stoker was the very first person to introduce the concept of a vampire hunter. His book was the first book where it wasn't just about vampires. There was someone there who was trying to kill said vampires. And the name of His vampire hunter was Abraham Van Helsing. What a popular, well-known character for us as well. Not just Dracula, but Van Helsing. Big deal for us when we think about vampire hunters. We think about him. Now, this helped create the trend that will move forward in the next few years of vampire stories of the whole vampire and vampire hunter. That is a new concept introduced, so now we're not just dealing with vampires and how maybe they're angsty about being vampires, but they're still killing people, or maybe they're just blood crazy, or maybe they're just, killing women and raping everybody out there, Now, it's about vampires getting killed by vampire hunters and things of that sort, or vampire hunters failing to kill vampires. Now, besides Dracula, that was the last big vampire story that was able to captivate audiences for a very long time. We're talking about no new concepts to the vampire world were introduced after Dracula until the golden age of science fiction. So the next period we're going to talk about in vampire literature that made a big impact is in 1954. Yes, that's right. We just went from 1897 to 1954. Clearly, there was a huge gap. 1954, we're going to talk about I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. Now, Richard Matheson's book popularized the use of vampires in science fiction in this post-apocalyptic vision of a world crippled by a disease that induces vampirism. The novel, as we well know, has been adapted multiple times into different films over the years, and it is often referred to as the first modern vampire novel. So, if you thought Dracula was the first modern vampire novel, you are mistaken, my friend. It is I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is 1975, Stephen. I always say Stephen. It's Stephen. I think it's the whole wanting to read things as they're, pronouncing things as they're read. Stephen King, the master of modern horror. He wrote Salem's Lot in 1975, and there he reopened the doors of vampirism to a new set of fans. This book puts vampires into a sleepy marine town in the 20th century, and mayhem ensues. As we know with any Stephen, my goodness, Stephen King novel. I'm sorry, I'm probably going to call him Stephen multiple times. It's Stephen, my goodness. Stephen King. You can tell that I'm not the horror type person, can you? When you can't even pronounce Stephen King's name. I said it right this time. Well, yeah, as you can tell with any novel that he's written, definitely a lot of mayhem and chaos. Salem's Lot, if you haven't read it and you're a fan of horror, go ahead and pick it up. If you want to read a vampire book, there you have it. Stephen King's Salem Lot. Give it a look-see. Now, the next time period we're going to talk about is 1976 through 2003. And here we have Anne Rice, who publishes her Vampire Chronicles. And things then begin a new era of change. And in this multi-volume series, we reinvigorate the concept of erotic vampires that was first presented in Carmilla. Yes, we're back to the sexy erotica that we had with the vampire lesbian people. Except this time, it's a chronicle. And I don't know if it's about lesbians. I'm pretty sure it's not about lesbians this time. I could be mistaken. Now, this first book steps away from this book series steps away from the concept of vampires being chronically evil, intrinsically evil, and starts portraying them as romantic anti-heroes caught in a poetic and tragic web. Edward Cullen. The birth of vampires in that direction. Not really the birth, but restatement of. Now we're moving away from the typical I'm a vampire and my goal is to kill people and suck their blood because that's what I do. And now instead of that, what we got going on is vampires who are like, oh my gosh, I love you so much and I'm not the bad guy, but I'm not the good guy, kind of a badass. I'm like Wolverine, but I'm a vampire and I'm so sad that I gotta kill you and suck all your blood out, but in the process, you think we can get some really nasty stuff in between, involving you and me and our bodies and the joining of them? That's what we got going here, people. Now, with this series, we see Gothic subculture and vampirism merge into one. This series inspired many romance writers to delve into fantasy and start writing into the subgenre of what is supernatural romance. And as we all know, it has grown largely. I mean, just go to the werewolf section in Wattpad. It's huge. So nowadays, it's one of the biggest subgenres of romance. Supernatural romances. Who wouldn't want some of that? Anyways, in this period, we also were introduced to Kristen Feehan's Dark series and Laurel K. Hamilton's Anita Blake Vampire Hunter series. Now we're going into present-day vampires. And what are we going on? What's happening now, modern day? Well, what we're seeing nowadays is that vampires are once again in the bestseller list. If Twilight wasn't enough evidence of that, I don't know where you've been living, because Twilight is like incredibly famous. Whether you love it or hate it, you gotta admit, it went big in a big way. We got Twilight. We have the Vampire Diaries. We have True Blood. We have so many huge vampire romance deals going on right now. It's like, boom. It has exploded in the genre. So right now, bestseller lists, vampire stories, they're a good way to go. But right now, the type of vampires we're talking about are the type that we were described with Anne Rice. The type that we're talking, it either goes romantic, like Twilight, or erotic, like True Blood. Which, as we know, the series is Southern Vampires / Suki Steakhouse. That is the name of the series. It's not True Blood. True Blood is the TV series. Now, when we look at these two, we take Twilight, we take True Blood. Let's take those two. Vampire Diaries, let's just put that in another shelf for now. Twilight, Twilight, True Blood. In Twilight, what we're seeing is this gentle, I guess you could put it, this sort of tragic, melodramatic, oh, I'm a vampire, but I don't like being a vampire, but I can't help the fact that I'm a vampire. I'm getting comments right now. Oh my god, I have a lot of comments. I'm sorry about this. Give me a moment. Oh my gosh, hold on. So many. I am so sorry. I feel so bad making these breaks because I know that by the time you get here, you're going to be like, why are you pausing, Lily? But I'm sorry. I get your comments really late, guys. Vampire sucking blood without fangs. I know, it's like, how? Lord Byron. Nice. Yeah. Must read. Quadruple X. New rating. Yep. For the truly intense. It has images too. They mix it up. To introduce the whole antagonist problem. That's very interesting. We got to read all this. Chef, don't judge, Lily. I started reading Dracula and it was too boring. Tedioso. It was thriller-like and it was good, but it was too long. I think a suggestion for you, Isander, if you have a Kindle, and if you don't, then I don't know. You'll have to find another option. But not the newest Kindle, not Paperwhite. You need one of the older Kindles. they're a lot cheaper to get. It's a good investment because then if you have to read a novel for the university and you're really not into it, it has the option of reading to you, and you plug in your headphones and it reads you the story. And that's what I did with Frankenstein, because the words were like very heavy and it was a lot harder for me to just like really delve into it. So what I did was I listened to Frankenstein instead of reading it, and since the voice is robotic and he's undead, I just felt it was appropriate. So, and you can choose male or female. So if you have a female narrator, you can have a female reading to you, and if it's a male narrator, you can have a male reading to you. So you can do that for Dracula. You can listen to Dracula and then it'll be a little more bearable. It's my suggestion. I need to read Camilla, I agree. The length is not a problem, it's just the way it's written. I agree. It's just, you know, it was a different way of writing back then, and it's very heavy for younger, well, we are younger audiences, I don't know, for any audience really. I feel like it's very heavy. It's heavy reading. Vampires glitter in the sun. That's the horror of today. I wouldn't say horror. It's part of that big movement that we got going on with the whole romance vampires that were introduced not that long ago. Now, with Twilight, what do we got? We got that angsty vampire that's a vampire, but he doesn't want to be a vampire, and he's like the anti-hero, and he falls in love with the girl, and it's so tragic and poetic, and blah, 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 blah. That's what you got there. And it's Twilight is meant for, you know, adolescent girls. Let's be real. It's like One Direction. It's meant for adolescent girls. So, also, put a note on Twilight. We're not done talking about that. There is a couple of other things we need to talk about Twilight, but setting that aside for now. True Blood. Now, with True Blood, we see a more steamy and sexual universe, similar to that of Rice's novels, which was very sexual as well. In True Blood, it's different because with True Blood, vampires have lived among humans for thousands of years, hiding, only to reveal themselves after medical breakthrough produces synthetic blood, through which the vampires are able to sustain themselves rather than having to drink from humans. So now that they don't have to kill people and they can just drink synthetic blood, they become part of the society. And in the True Blood series, there is plenty of sex. So, you know, if you want to read something about vampires and you want to read something very sexual, then Southern Vampires / Suki Steakhouse, also known as True Blood, is for you. Now, when we talk about why is this so popular and why does it focus so heavily on romance, relationships, sex, and emotional aspects of vampirism, you know, there's just been a resurgence of these things right now. Like, that is what has been popular. But don't think, oh, that's all we got going on right now. All we got is the sex and romance and, oh my god, yes, give it to me, vampires. Don't think so, because remember that in literature, when there is one strong action, there is a strong counter opponent. And because of series like Twilight, Vampire Diaries, True Blood, because of things like that, now we are starting to see books that are about the terrible, powerful, unsympathetic monsters that kill humans. So if you want to read some blood and gore and murder and I'm not in love with anyone, I just want to kill the people kind of thing, then these books are the ones for you. There's a trilogy written by Chuck Hogan and Guillermo del Toro known as The Strain. That's the first book. Oh, I'm sorry. No, I read that wrong. The series that they have, the trilogy, is called The Strain. That's what it's known as. The trilogy by Chuck Hogan and Guillermo del Toro, The Strain. Another trilogy that you can read, which is also about these types of vampires, is Justin Cronin's trilogy. He has already written 2 books. The third one is supposed to be published now in 2014. So the first 2 books are called The Passage and The 12. The final book is going to be called The City of Mirrors. So check that out. If you guys want to read books that are about vampires that kill people and suck blood and are evil, then go ahead and check out those two trilogies, The Strain and the trilogy by Justin Cronin, The Passage, The 12, and The City of Mirrors, which, based on how things have been going with books recently and so many movies being based on books, I wouldn't be surprised if we see some new horror movies about these aforementioned trilogies. Excuse me in a moment. We are getting some more viewage here with comments. Give it to me, vampires, yes. Okay. So that's what we got going on with the vampires of today. And for now, you know, supernatural is in. Also post-apocalyptic worlds and... oh my god. Ah! Dystopian. That word. It escaped me for a moment. Now, I said we were going to put a note in Twilight and we needed to talk about it. So we're going to talk about it. Now, when I said we were going to put a note on Twilight, I'm not saying we're going to have some sort of fan discussion related to Twilight. I'm saying we're going to talk about Twilight as why Twilight is what it is. And why are vampires in Twilight so different from vampires elsewhere? Here is the reason why. In Twilight, when Stephenie Meyers wrote that book, and she stated it herself, she did no research on the folklore of vampires or vampires in literatures or vampires throughout literature. She did zero research related to vampires. And so when she wrote it, it was whatever ideas she had in her mind, whatever she pictured as a vampire. And in fact, she stated that she didn't know anything about Dracula. You know, Dracula, the famous Dracula by Bram... my goodness, forgot his name. So much shame. By Bram Stoker. The famous Dracula by Bram Stoker. Stephenie Meyers, at the time that she wrote them, was not familiar with such a thing, and she did no research on it. Now, what am I going to say about this for us aspiring writers? I am not saying that it's wrong to write about vampires differently than they are portrayed in folklore and literature, but when we write, it is indeed important to research. It makes our novel that much better. Our novel, short story, poem, it makes it that much better when you research. In poems, you can get away with a little less research because it's very ambiguous and a very figurative language. But in short story, and especially in novels and novellas, you really can't get away. You really cannot get away with this whole not researching thing, because research is what's going to up the quality of what you write. Now, I'm sorry, I was distracted by the sounds in the background. Can you just give me 1 second? Hey! Okay, sorry. Anyways. So yes, the thing about that, she didn't research. That's why her vampires are so different from the typical vampire. They are from whatever her mind thought was a classical vampire, and then her own adaptations upon that. And there's nothing wrong with that. But really, what I recommend you should do is, when you're writing, research, and then choose to either use that information or not. But at least you're aware of it. You know. And if you don't want to do it that way, then don't. You don't have to. Like, my take on vampires, right now, something that I'm doing, this is not a book I'm currently writing, but I am slowly but surely creating the universe that my stories take place in. I want all my stories in the long run to be placed in a universe. So I'm creating what is my universe. and I am redoing all these different things. And vampires are a thing that I'm writing my take on vampires, what my vampires are like. And there are many areas and many aspects where these vampires are different from the traditional vampires, but I'm aware of what a traditional vampire is like. So I'm aware of it, and I'm choosing not to incorporate that. And by having that knowledge, I can even state in the story, have people question, like, have characters question, but aren't vampires supposed to this, and that? And then explain why my vampires don't this, and that, and give valid explanations, because I'm aware that this is the typical image of a vampire and why I chose not to follow that. Or at least, if asked, I can tell you this is why I didn't do it. So research, research is so important. And maybe, I'm not saying that it would have been different, but there's always a, at least if she had researched, then in interviews she could defend herself a little better than just saying, I honestly did not do any research on vampires, and that's why my vampires are so different. At least if she had researched, then she could say, I did research vampires, but I chose to make my vampires different. And then she could have given her reasons as to why she decided to make them so different from the traditional route. Really, it's fine. I mean, I'm not saying that might have not necessarily changed, what vampires are today. Not what vampires are today, I'm sorry. That may have not necessarily changed what Twilight is today, but I just feel like it's a lesson that we have to learn. We that are aspiring writers need to learn that research is so important. You need to research when you're writing, and you can't just throw carrots to the wind and say, I'm just going to write whatever comes out of my brain. Research is important. And look, I'm going to, since I was watching The Fault in Our Stars today at the movie theater, I'm going to go ahead and use John Green as an example. John Green went on a trip to Amsterdam so that he could do research for his novel, because in his novel he wrote about Amsterdam. So he went there and he learned about Amsterdam. He went to the places he wrote about. And that helped him make a better final product. I'm not saying we all have the resources to fly to Amsterdam, but that doesn't mean you can't sit down and Google what Amsterdam is like and do research. And heck, with the internet, you could even talk to someone from Amsterdam and ask them questions. So I'm just saying, research, research, research. It helps improve the quality of your writing. Writers write about what they know. We write about our lived experiences. And well, yeah. Another thing I'm reading here, one of the comments by Miguel. As writers, we need to read the classics and authors on our area of interest and out of them, of course. To avoid the repetition of themes and characters, it's all about reading and research. Yes, reading and research, totally essential, and I definitely think that what helps, think about, where do I want to write? We're working on becoming great writers, so think about, what genre do I want to write in? Where do I want to focus my attention? What do I like to write in? For example, I know Maria really enjoys historical, so if she wants to write in historical, that means that she has to read historical fiction. She can read whatever she wants. I mean, most published works by well-known publishers are very good and well-written, so you don't really have to worry that much. But you can also read some classics. That will definitely help as well. Now, I personally always, I've always felt that I was either going to go fantasy or sci-fi, because I can write a story, but I always put something else in there that is like, why do you put that in there? It's like, I need to, I like having that supernatural element in my stories. For example, if you look at Sunflower can have a perfectly fine plot without it having to be supernatural. It doesn't have to be supernatural, because I have other plot issues that occur that are enough to sustain a conflict. However, I put supernatural elements in it anyway, because I always put supernatural elements in everything I write. And of course, the supernatural elements bring forth even newer and more complex conflicts than the ones that there were already established. So it just keeps getting more and more complicated and more conflicted. Now, that helped me base myself like, I am going to write about things that are supernatural. I'm either going to write science fiction or fantasy, and I know that's the genre I'm going to write in, so I already know that if I'm going to read, I should read books about science fiction and about fantasy, because that'll help me write better in that genre, to be aware of what other people have written in that genre too. So, most important lesson of all this, do your research. You know, that is super essential when writing. And yeah, different cup. Research. That's the most important lesson that we need to take away from all this, I feel like. And that has been vampires in literature. I was very intrigued by all the things that I read, and I found it very amusing to know that John Polidori, the creator of the vampire, not the vampire, I mean the vampire with a Y, the creator of the vampire, was in Lord Byron's Celebration. Yeah, I found that very amusing. Like, oh wow, that the story that made vampires famous in literature and Frankenstein happened. I'm sorry. In that same group of people, I found that very amusing, and I'm really hoping. I haven't looked that information up yet, but I'm really kind of secretly hoping that what popularized werewolves was also part of that. Thank you. Just gonna. And I just spilled that all over myself in live video. Great job, Lily. Well, yeah. That has been vampires and literatures for you. And also such critiques works. So yeah. Oh, and here's another thing that I recommend you guys do that I didn't do before when I read. I don't know if you guys do it. As you know, a lot of people when they read, especially academically, they tend to make little notes in the book and highlight and all that. And you can do that in digital books too. You know, Kindle allows you to highlight fragments and to add comments to fragments and things like that. And PDF Reader does as well. And I used to not do that, but now I highlight things that I find amusing, and sometimes I comment on them physically or not, but I just feel like highlighting certain things just actually helps in the process of me reading. And later, I can look back on those things that I found important and read them over if something great was written in them. And at least The Fault in Our Stars, wow, okay? And I'm not just talking like detaching myself from the story. The book, if you look at the words, just look at the words, just look at the sentences, just look at the paragraphs, not the meaning behind them. Just look at it. Just look at it. You know, it is quite a book. I love how it is written. The writing in it, I love the writing. And it has some areas there that were just like, wow. So I recommend, you know, if it's not your cup of tea in terms of story, then don't read it because it's going to be tedious for you. But it is very good. And I am very excited to read the other John Green books I have. And it's no surprise to me that he has Prince Awards because that writing, man, that writing, it was good. And the dialogue, they call him like a master of dialogue, and it is so true. He had things that he said in those dialogues, the ways the characters expressed themselves, it was impressive. You know, the way that they described things and said things in the novel was impressive. So I recommend reading The Fault in Our Stars, and don't just read it. When you're reading it, look at what you're reading. Look at what is stated in it, because the writing is really, really good. It's a great example of good writing, and you definitely want to look at the writing. That's my tip. Also, I was looking over here at the book because I have it on Kindle, and I just want to verify if you have Kindle on your mobile, if it's possible to listen to it. And I think you can. I'm trying to check out. Do you have to buy it again, or can you just, let's see, switch between reading and listening in the app or different devices? Once you download the audio version, okay. Okay. But do you need to buy it? I don't know. I'll get back to you guys on that another time. But yeah, that has been our workshop for this week. We have talked about vampires and whatnot, and I really hope that you guys enjoyed it. And I'm sorry about the video quality, but truly there is nothing I can do. We're stuck with webcam quality. I've tried to attach external cameras to the feed, but I have not figured that out. I've tried to figure out how you do it. No clue. So that conundrum continues. And I may have used that word wrong, but, I think I used it right. But just in case, just putting it out there. Who knows? Well, yeah, that is what it is, and that's all we have this week. Vampires in literature, a little overview on folklore. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned a lesson about research. I know that Twilight is viewed very negatively. Personally, I read all 4 books. I thought they were good. I enjoyed them. I really did. Then again, I was a teenage girl, so I don't know if I'm the person who can give the best judgment considering the book was aimed towards my age group. I was the ideal target, and I did definitely, it hit the target. I enjoyed it. So I don't know if I can be the best judge of it since, it was meant for my age group, my gender group, it was meant for where I was at that time. So I don't know if I'm the best judge, but I liked it. And even so, I feel like we could learn from the mistake that it was a big issue with a lot of people. And I think the reason it was such an issue was because she didn't research about vampires. And had she done research about vampires, I just feel like the end result would have been something that wouldn't have caused so much conflict. Because I agree that the whole vampires shining in the sunlight is just, that was not cool. The rest of it was fine, but the sunlight thing, I feel like could have been played out a little differently. But the rest, I think it was pretty much fine. I mean, really, what's the biggest critique on the vampires? Just their general personalities and the shining in the sunlight thing. So a little research could have solved a lot. Anyways, I hope you learned a lesson about research. I hope you also learned a lot about literature and vampires and how they have been portrayed so that you have ideas for how you want to portray them. And also I hope that you found books within the ones that I mentioned that you would be interested in. So I hope. I will be leaving all the links to the articles that I read down below in the description, and as usual, we'll have the links to all our pages. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and, thumbs up, and let's get going then. See you next week with our next workshop, and next week we are going to be talking about werewolves in literature. And that one, we got a lot of interesting stuff related to how they're portrayed nowadays. That should be interesting. Also, the link to the video about weaknesses that vampires have will also be down below. It is hilarious. I recommend you watch it. It's really not that long, so if you haven't seen it, check it out. Genuinely funny. Hope you all enjoyed this podcast, and it's not a podcast, it's a live show. I'm so sorry. I always call it a podcast. Anyways, so I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned a lot, and I will definitely see you guys next week. So see you then, and next week we got the werewolves. So see you then with the werewolves or whatever. Yeah. Bye. Yes, I know. I'm going on and on, but I do that. We have established that I do that. Stop with the criticizing. My technical assistant is criticizing me. I have one of those now. Don't have a co-host though. Anyways, bye. See you next week. Or maybe it'll be Miguel, but you'll see someone next week.